So welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Leah Lamb, and we are entering into the realm of sacred storytelling. And we just got to do this little brief introduction of who we are. And I just so appreciate, Susie, what you just said in terms of, I don't teach people how to tell storytelling. I more guide people. And to be honest, I don't know that you actually can teach people how to do storytelling, because we are born storytellers. It's actually in our bones. It's in our biology. It's who we are. And so right now, what I'm going to do is we're going to walk across the threshold of what is it to be a sacred storyteller in our times? What is it to be a conscious creator in our times? And that's kind of the territory that we're going to be wandering around. I'll be sharing a lot, and at times I'm going to ask questions. They're real questions. I really want to hear from you. I love what you bring actually like feeds and nourishes our greater conversation. And there's no wrong answer. You know, it's great. It's all nourishing. So I'm going to begin with a quote that I just love. We think we tell stories, but often stories tell us. They tell us to love or hate, to see or be seen. And often, too often, those stories will saddle us, and they'll ride us, and they'll whip us onward, and they'll tell us what to do, and we do it without questioning. I'm going to ask you just to take a moment to pause and think about if you've ever had a story saddle you or whip you onward or tell you what to do. And if you have, I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat box. The rest of this quote goes, "The task of learning to be free requires learning to hear those stories, to question them, to pause and hear silence, to name them, and then become a storyteller." That quote's by Rebecca Solnit, and I love it. I absolutely love it. And I am going to ask you if you want to start feeding our conversation right off the bat. If you've ever noticed, if you've ever caught, there's a story that has influenced the role that you play in life, has influenced the way that you think about the world, has made you question or doubt. You know, if you can get your hands on the reins of any of those stories right now, and don't worry, because our whole class is committed to kind of playing this game. So if the ideas aren't popping right now. And I love this quote in particular, because it really speaks about kind of an unspoken runway into the realm of storytelling in terms of being like, what is it to become a storyteller? And we're living in the information era, right? And we're living where people are just the line between knowledge, wisdom, and educated. It's just a weird blend right now. You know, I can't wait to see how we look back and talk about these times. And we figured out the biology. And so there's a lot of people that will tell you the 6 bullet points of storytelling, you know, and they're going to tell you how to manipulate the brain because we figured out how to do it. You know, we figured out how to use story as a weapon against us rather than a tool, which was what it was designed for us to explore our consciousness. And what I appreciate in this quote is that it talks about if we can't get our eyes on the story, and if we can't engage our critical thinking to wonder about if that's a story that we want to inhabit our beingness. It speaks specifically about the role of pausing and hearing silence. If we can't identify where that story is living in the territory of our consciousness, what is it connected to? I'm going to go straight to an old teaching that I learned from Tyson Yakamura, and he talks about, you know, you can trust a story if you know where it's from, and all stories are from the land. You know, like how do you trust a story? Where does it come from? Who were the creators that made it? And in the same way, you know, we can look at where is the story connected to in our own consciousness? Where is the story living in our consciousness? You know, is it connected to a core wounding from our childhood, or is it connected to, you know, something that happened in world politics? Are we in relationship to the moment that we're living in? Or are we in relationship to something in the past? So that's that pausing to hear silence, to actually recognize where is the story being fed from? It can be a really powerful moment as storytellers. And then, you know, we get to declare What are we going to give life to? And this is where I think humans are. We're so amazing. It's so insane that there's a story that people are bad for the planet. It's absolutely insane. Greed's bad for the planet. People are cool. We're amazing. Like we are this, we are the channel between heaven and earth. And that's what we're doing with our storytelling. So if you want to get straight to the mystic, wild magic of what is story, who are we as storytellers? What are we doing is, we get to bring energy from the earth. We get to bring inspiration from the heavens. It meets, it electrifies, it's given an electrical pulse, it's giving energy through our heart, it's given resonance through our voice, where it can then find other places of matching resonance. So when we're thinking about the power of what it is to be storytellers, we are giving life where there wasn't life before to walk among us. You're like, what are you talking about? I'm going to go into that just a little bit more greater detail. So let's kind of get into the power and the juiciness and the love of words. So the Hawaiians say that words are so powerful that they can raise enough energy to slow the world or to slow it into motion. I didn't say that right. Let's do that again. Hawaiians believe that words are so powerful that they can raise enough energy to slow the world or to set it into motion. And if you've ever gotten to see the hula and get to see an embodied prayer of people who know that they can call the clouds, this is not some ancient myth told from another time. This is understood and put into practice in our time. This is still happening. Sicilians believe that words can poke holes in the universe. I always think about that when my temperature rises a little bit, getting in an agitated argument. And then some more force will come behind the words. And Sicilians, I imagine that they know a little thing about tempers. And so there's some wisdom about how what you say can't ever be taken back. And there's actually even a kind of a word in physics that speaks to this, that when a word has been spoken in a place, it lives there forever. Sometimes I think about that when I go to really ugly truck stops when driving through the highways, United States. I'm like, oh, this is, to my eye, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, this place is really ugly. Well, maybe I'll just sing a song when I walk through here and leave the notes like that. And maybe that to me is beautiful, and someone else that's horrible. Who's to say? Australians say that the stories of the past need to be sung to the present so that the future can exist. I'm talking about, we understand that our stories are connected in a kind of linear, non-linear time that is not to be fully understood. The Maori say that the words don't describe a thing, they are the thing. In Japan, there's a word called kotodama, and it means word spirit. And it speaks to the life and the spirit of the word before it even comes into form of being spoken. And all the ancient religions agree that the world was sung, spoken, and chanted into existence. I'm going to say that one more time because it goes back to this idea that humans are wondrous beings. We're incredible. We do something that, as far as we can tell, no other being does it in the way that we do it. Where all the ancient religions agree that the world is sung, spoken, and chanted into existence. Our words can actually influence the actions of another to change and shape the form of matter. Isn't that kind of a mind-blowing thing? I think, like, the airplane was a vision, was an idea, came from imagination. Well, came from inspiration from nature, but it's like, still, it's like, this is what we're looking at. And I want to be humble in this, right? Because, if we really have an animistic perspective, we really truly understand that, there are some animals that have figured out how to learn our language, but we haven't figured out how to learn most others' languages, right? So it's like the birds are singing the world into being. The whales are singing the world into being. God knows the frogs are singing the world into being, but are they changing the shape and form and matter? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Maybe they're doing way more than we probably can even imagine or realize. But it comes back to, who are we as storytellers? I want to give you just a little bit more ways to fully fall in love with stories. There's this, a poem called Magic Words, and it's by Edward Field. It was translated by Edward Field. In the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal if you wanted, and an animal could become a human being. And sometimes there were people and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. And that was a time when words were like magic. The human mind had mysterious powers. A word spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It would suddenly come alive. And what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. And nobody could explain this. That's just the way it was. That was translated from the Inuit. So, okay, so let us get into this little realm of adventures and storytelling. What is it? What's a story? I'm asking you in true form. And you can speak, you can put it into the chat box, but let's kind of get onto the same page of what are we talking about here? What is it? Be very quiet.
Today I was looking. I found a book in the charity shop. It's called God Knows Your Name, and I kind of thought about writing a story about my name because I was always jealous about other people's names. I wanted to be like Sophia or something like that, and my name is Susie. And then I looked it up in much, much, much more detail, and it has such a lineage. And then I sent a friend,
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you only because this is a long journey. And I so appreciate it. The story of our names, right? And it gives us shape and form and how we see and live in the world. And I'm going to tell you something. Someone just gifted me a new meaning of my name this weekend. And so I'm going to play with this with you because I think it's powerful. You know that my name's Leah. And when you look it up in the book, I think it means klutz, dunce, and I grew up with that, and there's no majesty in it, and Milan Kundera writes this whole, in one of his books, he talks about the power of names, and one of his characters, he named him both his first name and his last name the same name, but it was too powerful, and the man was crushed by the weight of his name. I love this. So we're again talking about that words have resonance, they have power, and they have a story that we then can live into or fall from. This woman also by Leah, I will say, came to me. She said, "Leah, do you know what your namesake means?" And I said, "No, I don't know. I had just told a story at a festival." And she said, "It means receiver of divine information." And I was like, "What?" And I love it. I don't know where she got that. I don't know if she just made it up. What is made up? To her, she had found this inspired, understanding of what it is. So what do stories do? Just in that little piece is they create some context. That we're meaning-making machines, and stories help us do that. A little fun fact is that we cannot metabolize information, data. So when people come at us, especially in the climate movement, and they start giving us lots and lots of data, if you're ever in a room, if you're kind of sensitive to energy, you're going to start noticing that all the energy goes, right? And it's like they can't, our energetics can't metabolize it. But with a story, all of a sudden, we can start making meaning. And our brains will always do that. I just read some fascinating research that when the body goes into a state of trauma and it thinks its existence is threatened, then it will start making stories immediately. It will start trying to make meaning of what's happening. So this might be your boss doesn't respond to you, right away, and you send an email, and all of a sudden you're like, "Oh my God, he hates me. He wants to fire me. This isn't going to work." Like the brain is concerned, or it could be all different kinds of things. So it's a fun way of looking at it. Another way of looking at a story is, if there's any more ideas in terms of, if you want to put things in the chat, in terms of what like what is a story? A very gross expression of a story is it's an operating system. and it's an operating system. The reason why I'm using that language is because humans often refer to themselves and reference the most recent technology. So we're in the computer era. And so when we look at that, then we're looking at, okay, then what do stories do? But they give us our values, our belief systems, and what we believe is possible. And we start teaching through stories at a very, very, very young age, right? We've got all the children's books, what's going around the tables, and listen to when if you've been around young children, you're so great. I love it how they teach us how we learn. We learn through repetition, right? And so they tell me the story again, tell me the story again. Tell me the story again. You're like, oh my God, how many times do you need the story? But there's something that their brains are doing, and that they're doing is they're putting the rhythm of story into their beingness. They know how to make sense of things. They know how to feel the values of it. I once got to see, and I wish I knew who this man was. I carry stories more than I carry the storytellers, which is something that I'm not proud of, but I often tried to source the storytellers every moment I possibly can. But this was a man who was teaching at the Indigenous Stories tent at Pioneers Conference many years ago. And he was talking about how embarrassed he was that he'd almost forgotten the power of working with stories as teaching tools. And when he realized this, when he had this 3-year-old son, and his 3-year-old son, they would go out to festivals and they would go to, ceremony, and his son was like, taking food off people's plates and bumping in line. And he was just kind of running after his little boy, being like, don't do that. No, don't do that. No, don't do that. He said he'd realized that he'd forgotten how to call on stories, that stories could be worked with and they could be allies. And so he and his son went home and they made up the story. And it was about good otter and bad otter. And good otter does this and bad otter does this. And now all of a sudden he started calling on the story to be the nanny in the room. He'd see his son doing something from across the room and he'd look at him and he said, are you being good otter? And all of a sudden the story is doing the work. So there's a way of being in relationship to stories that so many of us have fallen out of remembrance of being with, that they can be our allies, that they can do the labor for us, and that children are used to carrying stories, are used to working with stories, are used to finding themselves inside of stories. Another way of looking at a story, and I hate that description, operating system, it's so grotesque, it's not poetic. And I was walking through the canyon, and I live in Topanga Canyon in LA, and the trees, I swear to God, the trees were like, Leah, you got to stop calling stories operating systems. It's just grotesque. And I was like, I know, but it's simple and it gets to the point and people understand it, And they said, you got to tell them what stories really are. I said, what is it? They're like, it's a library of the soul. And I was like, oh yeah, stories are a library of the soul, right? And in this way, it's like stories are so much bigger than one person. John Steinbeck says that when you tell a story, it must be about the reader or it will not last. Another way of speaking to that is that the story has to have a sense of universality in it. That if I come to the threshold as a storyteller, as a sacred storyteller, I know that I now have come to a place in my life where I have a giveaway. I have something to give. And so this is a very specific journey that a storyteller will go on to come to this place where they know that their life is so valuable, that the experience that they've gotten, that the mistakes have given so much wisdom that that it would be selfish. There would be a selfish act to keep it to themselves. And so then they go into the state of the giveaway. Right? When we come to that place, it's like, it's your story is my story, and they start being about the universal experience of living. So when I end today, I'll do a giveaway and I'll give you a story that I haven't told in a really long time. So we're kind of talking about the job, the function of story, that it has a function. Now, what's a sacred story? What makes a story sacred? And I'm seeing that Emily is saying, okay, Judith is saying stories often give hope, right? It's like when I feel a story, you can take a story. My favorite example of a sacred story is Life is Beautiful. If you haven't seen that movie, it's just incredible. It takes place in the Holocaust. It takes place in a Holocaust camp. You're like, oh God, don't make me go see that one. I laughed, I cried, it was gorgeous. I was given tools for how to live through the most challenging times while being shown the most grotesque aspects of humanity, but also being shown how to live through the hardest times through a gorgeous story. You know, what better guide? In Welsh, the word storyteller means guide between the dimensions, between the worlds. You know, so what makes a story trustworthy is another thing. Like, how do I feel after I've received a story? And if I feel hopeful and alive and good, and maybe I access some grief that I couldn't access, and maybe I access a little rage that I was stuck and it wasn't really, it was turning into depression. And maybe I laughed, and maybe I got to see myself in a way that, oh, that was a little hard to see, but I saw it, and maybe I'm gonna, okay. And now I feel a little bit more hopeful in life. And by the way, I think I'm gonna exercise tomorrow, quit sugar, and I'm going to quit coffee too, and life is great. It's like stories can do this. They can fuel us with life force, and those are trustworthy stories. Those are trustworthy stories. Emily's also saying, I feel like stories share experiences with others, and great stories involve help the listeners feel like great stories will they'll help us access our emotions in a way that nothing else does. It's kind of wild, big magic. So when we're talking about a sacred story, what defines a sacred story? Because we know that stories are being used as weapons, right? They're used in marketers. I've had so many people come to me and they said, well, can you teach me how to sell my business? And I'm like, absolutely not. That is not my business to teach you how to use a tool as a weapon. Not to say that what you aren't doing isn't profound and beautiful. But a sacred story is something else. And it's not to be used. It's to come into relationship with. So think about any relationship you have with somebody. Hey, I just want to use you to sell my business. You're like, well, that person's not going to help you out. They're nothing. But what if you come into relationship with something? And so a sacred story, and just through its language, we're talking about that there's something that we're honoring the life inside of it. I honor the life within you. I see the divinity in you. So when we're talking about a sacred story, we're talking about an energy form, a life force that's something in it. So let me get a little bit linear here. So a lot of people say that the body holds the soul, right? And now we're going to say that the story, the structure of a story holds the spirit. And that when we allow a story to come into and through us, we are in relationship with spirit. Or let's just say, why make it so small? We're giving access to coming into relationship with the unseen world. And the unseen world can be many things. It can be your guides. It can be the ancestors. Sean Kane says that myths are earth speaking out loud. So I don't like to use words to define all this because I think it's so much bigger than a small little word, but we're going to use the tools that we have to kind of shape our understanding of what it is. We come into relationship with a sacred story. Now it's a humble experience for the ego. The ego's job is to make sure that you have done your job to use your vessel in good alignment. Your ego's job is to really understand, what am I in service to? What am I in service to? How do I want to use this precious life? Do I want to create communion, connection? Do I want to invite the sense of unity into the room, love into the room? Do I want to give people that powerful access to their emotions? Or will I allow my voice to be used to spread fear, to spread disconnection, to spread doubt? So this is again, it's like, how do you, I feel like once you're really put your sacred storytelling goggles on, it's just like putting goggles on when you go snorkeling. Without your goggles, you keep your eyes closed and you're like, I know there's a shark out there and some sharp coral, and you're kind of like, it's not very fun, right? But you put your goggles on and you're like, okay, now I can watch the show. And it's like, is that a sacred story coming at me? Is it life force giving? There you go. Quick definition. Is it life force giving? Or is it a zombie story? Is it a Death Eater story? Is it stealing life out of the room? Is it creating divisiveness and fear? This is the weird thing about stories, because they're very confusing. I think we're surrounded by clone stories. They look like stories, they smell like stories, they act like stories, but you can't remember them when they're gone. They disappear. Like a lot of marketing, like how many commercials do you remember? But you're left hungry, needing something. That's what you're left with. So this is it's a great way to if you really want to become a hunter of stories, a hunter-gatherer of stories, and really want to determine and distinguish which ones are you going to allow to live in your precious, landscape of their consciousness and to give life to. This is a great way. And there's a couple other tools that you can use, which are very basic and simple. Where does the story come from? Where does the story come from? Where does the land? You got to know, all stories come from a place, and to really understand a story, you have to understand the time that it was created in. What could be said, what couldn't be said. And then you have to start reading between the lines. And then to even take it one step further, you got to know the creator of that story. What could they say? One of my favorite little known facts was the story of Euripides and Medea. The Medea is a horrible story. That spread so much fear of women as being the destroyers of those things that they can create. And, what a mess of a story. When you go back to the history of how that was created, a story started banging on my door a while back and asking to be healed. And I'm like, what? It's like it wants to be healed. And I asked some friends of mine to come work with me on it because I could feel the power of it. It was a story of betrayal. And my partner who was on it, we put it out, and the room almost filled. We almost sold a half a theater worth of tickets overnight. We're like, whoa, this is really hot. She was like, I'm not touching that story. I can't do it. I have no forgiveness for Medea. She killed her kids. None. She was a new mom. And I was like, the story wants something from us, though. It's asking to be healed in these times. And I trust stories. I love this. Stephen Jenkins, it says, I trust stories more than I trust storytellers. And I would also add to that stories are often far more powerful than their storytellers. And that the more clear you are on who you are as a storyteller, the more of a chance you have to make sure that you're carrying good stories that will give to you as much as you give to them. So anyway, so Medea comes, and I understand that something's happening here. She's asking to be healed. She's going to a storyteller that will entertain the request. We start going on a big adventure to understand the story, to understand the times, to understand its creator. Well, it turns out Euripides, by gosh, playwright, was paid off by the townspeople whose king Medea had killed to write that Medea killed her kids when really the townspeople killed her kids. According to history, this is the true story. So we're left with a story that keeps going and going and going. The true history has been, buried in some book somewhere. But it even goes further, because Euripides, as a playwright, did what he was told. He wrote the story that he got paid for, but he did something else. In the course of writing that story, he'd done something that no one had done to the way that he had done before, which is to show a woman being incredibly powerful. And when that came out, they banished him. That was the end of his career. So complicated story. So to understand, it's like, don't ever think that understanding story is a simple business. It's not simple business. It's always complicated. Don't usually go off that rail. So I don't know who in the room is creating the complexity for this kind of conversation, because normally I just go by my little, I have a little PowerPoint over here. But we're going into the depths of this. So Emily's saying, can you speak more about the purpose of sacred stories? I think I just did, but in essence, they're life force giving. They bring us closer together. And when it comes down to this idea that stories are libraries of the soul, it means that we get to evolve together through each other's storytelling. Judith knows a thing or two that I don't know anything about. She's further down the road than I am. And so when I get to learn from her life, That means that maybe I don't have to step in the same potholes. Maybe I don't have to make all the same mistakes. Maybe I can go make a couple more. you know? and for and so we leapfrog each other. We're like, oh, I don't have to make that mistake, so now I get to make this mistake. But why call it a mistake? Why let's just call it a misalignment in the great life of what it is. And so this is how we learn together, through telling our stories. So when we don't tell our stories, when there's shame involved and we don't tell our stories, then that becomes dangerous business, because it means that there's often some aspect of repeat. We've heard that through different times and generations. When people don't tell their stories and they get stuck in them, then oftentimes they're not alone. There's a lot of other people living in the same story, but separately and isolated. So let me show you a little bit about what stories do through a Venn diagram. Hold on. Okay, so this is another way of looking at, like, what do stories do? This is the alchemy of stories. So they bring connection, and this is kind of amazing. Okay, so I'm gonna take you on a little journey. Once upon a time, not so long ago, not so far away, at the bottom of the ocean is a yellow brick road. And on that yellow brick road, there is a great big tree that grows golden apples. And skipping down that golden brick road is Dorothy, a mermaid, and a very small fairy. Okay, so how many of you saw that image? Okay. So what's happening is that something's happening in my brain. And the frontal lobe of my brain, while I see that image, starts getting super activated. They put neurons on people. And something's happening where we're like, there's this magic that's happening between us, right? We just time traveled. We reality bended. We location traveled. We did all these things together with, like, without the use of technology, right? Like, if we were in the room, the same thing would have happened. And so this magical thing that we do when we're together, Princeton calls neural coupling. Okay, and that neural coupling is that when the right side of my brain, that right lobe, starts getting super activated and I start creating images, so does your brain. The same area of your brain. We're going dee, 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 dee. And so this connection, this biological connection, is actually formed when we start telling stories. That's why it's like, when we look at, like, what are storytellers really doing? They're conductors. They're conductors of fields of energy. It's more than that. They're players in the realm of consciousness. Yeah. But here's what I'm also going to tell you. It's the greatest magic trick in the world, because a lot of people will think that the power is in the storyteller. But the true power in any giving and receiving relationship, and that's what storytelling is, we're entering into the regenerative cycle of life, of giving and receiving. Because no story can come alive completely by itself. It has to be done in connection. And so in that way, in order for the story to continue to live on, there has to be someone else to catch it. But when we go back to that first quote, the job of the storyteller is to determine if they want to catch that story, if they want to allow that story to come into their consciousness and live in the great real estate of their mind, to be given life, to be repeated, And we come into that question of, well, is this story going to serve life? Is it going to bring us together? Is it going to bring awareness? Is it going to bring connection? Is it going to do all these things? Is it going to bring it closer to yourself? Is it going to help you examine a part of you that you don't want to look at, but it's really going to be good to look at? Or is it going to do this other thing? And if you decide that you don't want to take it on, well, what a powerful move to make. And there we have, that's where the true power in the relationship lives, is in the story catching. So it's like, we can be we can be used against ourselves if we just take on any old story. And we're seeing that in the marketing realm. We just saw that an entire 100 years of people having stories used against them. And now we're coming to this known place where we're like, well, maybe we're not going to do that anymore. Anyway, So a little bit about how stories create connection and why it's necessary. They also, it's that realm of eldership, and I talked a little bit about that. It's where we share, it's a commitment to those who are coming behind us. It's about understanding the value of life and that you are part of the connection of life. And that when you understand that, then how could you possibly keep your stories to yourself? Because you're helping life continue on. You're helping those come behind us, behind you. We create a sense of belonging. You know, how many times have people felt all alone in their own life circumstance? And then someone else whispered that they were having a similar situation, you know, and then all of a sudden this rise of connection was again beginning to happen, you know. Stories can bring healing. And we've seen this a lot of times in different, especially in South Africa and the reparations, race relations reparations cases. And what did we see? But we saw a distinct process that was happening where people were given space to tell their story and to be witnessed and listened to. We understand how incredibly important that is. Now, I believe that there's a cycle of healing that happens, and that when we go in to really heal a situation like a massive traumatic event, at first we come in and we say, I have to be heard, I have to be witnessed. This is not about questioning, this is not about giving more information, you know. But then we come to another state where we're like, well, wait a second, I'm ready now to start healing the story. And one of the biggest, most important things to do is never tell the story twice. There's this great TEDx talk by this man. He did the talk at Charlottesville TEDx. He'd broken his legs, and his mother said, you will never tell the same story twice. And it was part of his healing, and she understood something. You know, what I understand is that we are not the same person. Like as we grow older, we are not the same person that story happened to. We're like trees. We should be allowed to grow, and put out our branches and eventually fruit. You know, same thing with our stories. Our stories shouldn't be forced to stay small. Our stories should be able to grow. We should be able to change our role in the story. We have more context, more understanding. And so one of the ways that I work with stories as a healing modality is we'll take the stories and we'll put it in the mythic dimension, and we'll get to see it as a soul story. We'll get to see the story of our soul. We'll get to see it through symbol form, through myth, through metaphor. And so that's a really important aspect, because people talk about, you know, wanting to be storytellers or wanting to talk story. But there's this thing where it's like, you know, you go to France, you learn French, you go to Spain, you learn Spanish. You want to go to the land of story, you got to learn the language of story, which is symbol, metaphor, and archetypes. You know, the spirit of life speaks through metaphor. And they say metaphor is language of spirit. I love that. You know, so there's this extraordinary capacity to come into healing through stories. And we can get access to perspectives, to wisdom, to guidance. You know, it's like whenever I'm super stuck in life, I'll go to my story and I'll put it in the mythic dimension and I'll say, you tell me what's happening. My ego is so connected to so much stuff, and it's trying to survive, and it really wants to be right. But I think I'm old enough now to realize that if I think I'm right, I'm definitely wrong. So you tell me, you know, because I can't get through this by myself. You know, and sometimes when we take our stories and we surrender our ego and we allow the story to come and help us, now we're really talking about a sacred story where we can get guidance and insight. They can act like bridges between worlds. There's been some phenomenal research that's been shown where, especially in TV programming, look, it's all in the language, operating systems programming. They said that when people who had very clearly defined belief systems around sexual identity and what was and what wasn't acceptable, when they started showing them TV shows like Will and Grace and other shows that showed transgender perspectives, and now the stories weren't about people, they were actually personal stories told from personal perspectives. It changed the perspective and of the people that were watching it. So we understand that real change in belief systems can shift and transform when we stop talking about others and we start getting to hear individual stories. It's also love. Stories are love to me. I've never, ever not fallen in love with someone who's told me a story. It's just like, it just happens. And I've never not fallen in love with the people who I've told stories to, you know, because there's a real connection that's happening between you. And so, it's an act of love, because it's also an act of bravery and courage, you know, to get yourself to that threshold, to someone who can do that. is really, it's no small pie. You know, it takes a lot of work and a lot of commitment and a lot of effort to get there. I'm going to show you one other thing in terms of what stories, like in the journey of a storyteller. And are you guys into the diagrams today? Is that helpful for you? Yeah, great. Okay, here's some more. So here we go. I don't show this one very often, but I think it's helpful. So who are you as a storyteller, and how do you get on this path? You know, and it's non-linear. It's just not linear, and you're born storytelling, right? But let's talk about what is it to be a conscious creator. And so courting the muse, you got to court the muse, you got to court that inspiration, you know, so that you're not in it alone. You know, like where are your stories going to come from? You're also going to need to really know yourself, you know, so it's like this path to psychic silence. Like the path to psychic silence means like that you can hear what is going on in your energetic system and your own constellation of space. You know, what are the stories that are yours to tell? And in that way, it's like you get to really understand, are you a cantadora, someone who's going to carry the old stories so that the future can exist? Because not many people are carrying those old stories, and they've got a lot of wisdom for us. You know, I can't think of all the things that we're going through right now. All the wisdom teachers have already been shared. You know, we have everything we need. It's like this massive library. It's just a matter of, are we calling on it? Are you someone that's here to tell your own story? You know, your bones are rattling. It's time for you to tell your story. And now you know that you need to share them. Or are you someone who's like a midwife to story, a story catcher, you know, and you're catching the inspiration and you're bringing in the news stories of our time. So I don't know that I think that there is a new story, but, you know, the stories of our time. So, but you've got to be able to have some quiet in there, you know, and I have a whole course that's committed to this. It's called Sanctuary, you know, and so that you can really hear clearly what wants to come through you. Then you're going to run into some barriers, because it's just, life is like that. And if you're living a full life and you get to be initiated, then you're going to run into those things that ask you to strengthen yourselves and strengthen your conviction and really hone and make your gifts super powerful, so that they can go out and walk outside of yourself and not just be inside of yourself. And I really think that's what initiation is. And storytelling is a key part of the initiatory process. And as coming out as a storyteller, it's initiation all into yourself. So you're going to have to see those barriers, and they can show up like fear. They can show up like doubt. They can show up like critic. They can show up in all these different ways. We come together and we get to be just curious about them, and curious about what are they offering, and find our ways over and around or through or transmute, or we understand like what are they there to do at that moment. Then at some point you got to look behind, and you have to know the old stories. When I teach a class called Mythos, I teach it, the very first thing that we do, we introduce ourselves all by telling an origin story. The reason I do that is because the stories are going to tell you how to tell a story. That's really, if you want to know the quick trick, that's, you know, I'm here. I will help you access your creativity and fine tune your skill. But to become a storyteller, you just got to read a lot of stories, and the rhythm will come alive in you and they'll awaken you. You know, go watch storytellers. They're going to awaken that part of you, you know. And so but we've got to know those old stories, because it's like, that's how our own rhythm gets awoken, you know. So you'll also look within, and you'll know, okay, there's stories. What created you? You know, who are your parents? What was your family? What are you made from? You know, these are going to inform the stories that you're going to want to tell or heal or carry forward or allow to retire and put down. You want to explore your storyteller archetype. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Stand in the power of your gift. You know, it's like, here you are, you know, gifted people, you got something to give, but wow, it takes a lot of courage, a lot of bravery, you know, some technique, and even a little bit of skill to tell stories in front of a group. And so now we're getting into that developing your skill and craft. Now, look, I started off in the world of professional theater when I was very, very young, went off to New York City, studied with Sandy Meisner. And in that realm, you learn craft first. You know, you learn how to use your tool first. And what I discovered through that and through other writing programs, as I saw so many brilliant creators get destroyed by teachers who are trying to teach them how to do things a very specific way, rather than access their own true genius and their own true voice. So what you're going to see here is I take a slightly different approach, because I feel like, number one, make sure that you can access your channel, access your creativity. There's a place for that genius. And, Michael Meade has done so much beautiful, generous work around reminding us that the genius, this is not like an egotistical, I'm so smart. This is like in Rome, in ancient Rome, when it was your birthday, they didn't celebrate you. They celebrated the genius that lived through you. It's the spirit of life. So, it's like, once you get hold of that, now let's talk about, craft and skill and all those kinds of good things, because so much of our life right now is poo-pooing our capacity to be able to do that. So let's get that back. And what is that getting back? But you access to your full and whole life force. So then we'll go into, now we're developing some craft, then we journey into the mythos, and we journey back into the mythic dimensions. Okay. And, this is where our fairy tales live, where all those other aspects of the mythic stories. And then I feel like one of the critical parts of being a sacred story in our time is being a listener. You start with listening. And so also then, what stories are you going to tell? What do the people around you need to receive? And then you are being a true guide, because that's what storytellers are. We're guides. We're going to talk about how to change a story, and I'm about to teach a course all about how to do a little bit of a changing a story, and I'll get into that. Then you alchemize your stories into medicine. And then again, that's the giveaway, as you offer your gift. Now, what are the storytelling archetypes? There's a lot of different archetypes. I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of them I'm going to talk about a lot, which is the Cantadora. These are the people that carry the old stories, and they carry them forward. So this is quite a generous thing, where people go and they'll find these old stories that are kind of lost and sitting in the old corners, kind of homeless. Many of them are kind of like homeless beings, starved. And they'll say, come on, I'm going to give you a home. I'm going to take you home. I'm going to feed you, and I'm going to, give you a place at the table again. And that's a lot of what, Cantadora is like, these people who are being with these old stories. That's a lot of what we're doing right now. There's the midwife. I talked about that. Story catchers. We're giving place for new stories to come among us. There's the healer, that person who's really working with stories around trauma and helping people heal through the expression of their storytelling. There's the wisdom keeper archetype, which is when, it's cliche, but, they say that there's truth in these cliches. Someone comes to the elder and they say, I don't know what I should do with my husband or my boyfriend or my girlfriend. And rather than, the elder tell them, break up with them or stay committed or, whatever it is, they give them a story so they can come to the source of their own wisdom. And that's what stories do. They give us access to our own deep knowledge, our own wisdom. There's a visionary. We just came out of a class like this. Kurt was there, where we told vision stories. We planted seeds for the future. And so when you keep going around and you start mixing this, all of a sudden you have a web, right? I love this. This is the image of a web. And that's one of the archetypes of the storyteller, which is the weaver, the spider. So that is our class for today in terms of an introduction into the realm of sacred storytelling. If you feel complete, then I wish you well on your journeys. And if you want to hear a little bit more about how you can work with me and School for Sacred Storytelling, I'm going to stay on for a few more moments where I'm going to talk about a course that's coming up. I'm going to give a sneak preview into what the School for Sacred Storytelling is about to do, which is extremely exciting. And then I'll end with a story. So that's what's happening. So what is coming up is that we've got a class called Cantadora. And this is a class that is all about getting to carry old stories. It's the only class that I teach like this. And in that way, I just put a link in the chat box. In this way, you'll get to learn stories from around the globe, but we're doing something a little bit different, and it's a powerful thing to really determine which of these stories want to continue to live among us. But then we're also going to be talking about the ethics of what is it to carry an old story, what is involved with that. And then we're also going to look at what is it to be able to tell a story in modern time. So it used to be that, it's like I'll listen to some stories that people will be carrying, and it's very, I can't get into the complexity of it right now because we have like a minute or two. But what I would say is that what I would say is that there's a real thing to be, what is it to allow these old stories that still want to speak to us, and how to come into relationships so that we're carrying the best parts of them forward, where we're understanding who they are, but we're also understanding what they're trying to speak to in our time and our way. And so we're going to be dedicating a month to doing that together. It's going to be really fun. And one of the aspects that you'll get is you'll get to learn so many stories from around the globe. You'll really get to build your confidence, and you'll also get to really understand the ethics and know that you're standing in a good way as a storyteller. That's coming up. And the other thing that's happening is that we have a class on fairy tales coming up, which I want you to know about, which is by Jacqueline Bushell. And this is kind of an amazing, lovely thing. And this is like the beginning of our new world order, which is that now there's many different classes that are coming up because the School for Sacred Storytelling is going through an extraordinary change. And what I mean by that is that for many, many years, I've been the main teacher, and I would bring in many guest teachers, and they would celebrate with us, and they would add to this grander conversation of storytelling. And I always named it the School for Sacred Storytelling because I always had a vision that we needed a place as a sanctuary where story could be honored and treasured as for what it really is, rather than what it's become, especially in my country, the United States. And now that time has come, where I'm going to be backing away from being the main teacher, and we're going to be creating an entire curriculum of classes. And that means that we're going to be looking at 3 different tracks of stories. And so, as I said, sacred storytellers, connection to earth, connection to spirit, and connection to the expression of story. So we have those 3 different tracks coming up, where you'll get to have sacred arts classes and connection to earth, along with Dina is going to be coming in and teaching classes on connecting with your spirit guides and really opening your spirit channel. And then we have Jan Blake coming in, who's going to be teaching so many amazing classes. I can't even begin. We just got off the phone with her a couple of minutes ago, but you're going to start seeing, short classes, longer classes that will really give you access to working with story in a whole new way, especially working with some of the older stories. And then we have a class coming up with Jackie. She's based in Australia. I just put the Eventbrite into that. It's a 2-hour class, and it's the whole history of fairy tales. This is an incredible class. It is one of my favorites. So if you really want to deepen your understanding of, she's done such a great job of studying this. It's put together a profound class of really understanding the origin of these stories and how they've emerged to live among us the way that they do. So that is happening. So I'll just give you that. Okay. Any questions before I carry on? Okay, no. The one thing I'll add is that there is still space in a retreat that I'm teaching in Crete that's coming up, and it's happening in May. It's a rites of passage retreat for women of all ages. And it's really there for, again, claiming our stories as being critical, playing a critical role in our evolutionary process. We don't have, when so many of us didn't get that opportunity to have major life stages witnessed, and we also didn't get to release the old skins as we fully step into the newest archetype of what we are becoming. And so if you're feeling called for that, that's happening in Crete next month. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story. I'll just really change for just a moment. This story begins with a woven painting on my bedroom wall. And I was very young. I might have been like 3 or 4 or 5, just learning how to be, just learning words and letters, and couldn't make much sense of it. But I was beginning to learn how to read this thing. And it was this picture of this woman, and she was giving flowers to a bunch of children. And it said, "Give what you have, Leah, to someone else. It may mean more than you dared to think." And I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea. And so that's why I think I must have read it 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 times, repeating it over and over and over again. Give what you have, Leah. It may mean more than you dare to think. So that might have been why, when I was sitting there across from the doctor 25 years later, when he was telling me that they were going to be cutting across my throat and they were going to be cutting across my larynx, and there was a very good chance that I might be about to lose my voice. All of a sudden, as my mind tried to make meaning of this moment, I remembered that teaching from long ago. Now, something that you might not know, or maybe you do know, but I had grown up where I had really gotten to know the victim archetype very well. And I had had a series of things that had happened where I had learned that if I played the victim, then I would get the attention that I really, really wanted. And I got really good at it. I got so good at it that I could out-victim story anybody in the room. It became a sport. And then all of a sudden, in this moment, in this critical moment in my life, I was told that I could, it was as if they were like coming to me with the purple velvet pillow, with a tiara of victimhood. And they were coming and they were like, "Here, have it." And at that moment, I was like, no, I don't want it. And in that moment, when my soul came online and decided that, it was like this little window opened up. There was an escape hatch and I jumped through it. And I was like, I want a different story. I want another way of being in this. And all of a sudden, I didn't know the words. I didn't know what role to play. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. And so I started laughing. I started making jokes. This new version of myself came alive. She started making jokes. And she said, "Well, you just say that to all the pretty girls, don't you?" And the doctor was so taken aback. He was like, "No, this is real. Like, it's in the contract. Like, you have to know that this is real." And I was like, I know. And it became my sport as I was going through what would be one of the more terrifying experiences of my life. I had just been diagnosed with having thyroid cancer. It was a very extreme case. I had tumors growing up in my neck. They had spread. They were going, and they had to do this very fast surgery. And I realized that all I wanted to do was research and get control of the situation. And I wanted it desperately not to be happening, but there was no way out of it. And there was also no way I could control it. And so I took on what I could take on, which was every time I went in for a blood test, every time I met with a nurse or a doctor, I had one job and one job only, and that was to make us laugh. And I didn't even know who this person was. She was a great coping mechanism. We had a lot of fun together. And those appointments were way more fun because it's way more fun to laugh than cry, by the way. And so that's what was happening. And when I came out of the surgery, something else happened where they take this mirror and they come over to me, you're all groggy and all out of it. And they take it to me and they're like, "We just really want to warn you. It's pretty extreme. And it's sort of like it's sort of like a hockey stick across your neck." And I had these huge black X's, stitches that came all the way down, all the way around. And I looked like Frankenstein. It was pretty crazy. And I looked at it, and the first words out of my mouth, out of anesthesia, was, "You monogrammed my initial backwards on my neck." And they were like, "Who are you? Like, how are you cracking jokes coming out of anesthesia?" And I was like, I don't know who I am. And I don't know how I'm cracking jokes coming out of anesthesia, but something else was coming on board. When I got out of the hospital, they put me on the wrong drugs. I was on speed rather than normal thyroid meds. I had so much energy. I called my friends together. I said, "Let's build a big garden." And they're like, "Leah, you're crazy. You just got out of the hospital." I was like, "I know, I'm crazy. I've got all this energy. Let's use it." And so we did. We built this 60-foot spiral garden. And that was the garden that saved my life. Because pretty soon the over medication ended up, it was like speed. I went into a deep depression. I got deeply exhausted, and all that grief and all that fear caught up to me. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I had no words for anybody. Life was very black or white. It was either life force giving or life force taking. And that garden was giving me life. And every day I would go to that garden and I would walk those spirals. And I would give my gratitude for life. I didn't know anything about gratitude before this happened. Nothing. The land taught me that. And it also taught me how to pray. And so every day after I gave my gratitudes going to the center of that garden, I prayed. I prayed for my life as I came out of that garden. And it was those prayers that led me to you today, in this moment, in this story. And so, with a little bit of a story for you today, may you carry your own stories. May you find what they want to reveal and give to you. And may we cross again sometime soon. The one last thing I'll add is that I won't be teaching much longer. This is my last class and I'm teaching online. Hi, Emily. But I do private sessions. I work with people privately. And I also do an ancient mystic form of storytelling called medicine stories, or called soul stories. And so those are one-on-one sessions. And I also help people come into alignment with their own creative life force. So a pleasure to be with you today. And I will turn off the recording. If you have any questions, I'll stay on, and then we'll wish you adieu.